Get going. Um, so first of all, um, my apologies that this title is not the same as you've seen in the schedule. It changed over the last 2.5 years. What happens in we are away for a bit, but I'm really happy to see everyone here, even if you're just leaving. And um, so yeah, great to have everyone here in the room again, and so we can like really see each other and talk to each other and ask questions. And I would almost say just ask any question you have during the whole talk, just because interaction. So so my name is Mark. I am a senior web developer and architect at Limoen Groen in Amsterdam, where we try to build sustainable websites. That's what we call it. But well, you know the drill. Let's get going with what we are here for. Um, Help. My client wants PWA. I called this session this title because this is well pretty much what happened to us when um, a client asked us to build a PWA and we hadn't done it before. Well, obviously this client didn't ask, "Hey, can I get a PWA?" But they asked for certain behaviors, certain features in the site that had seen elsewhere, and they asked, "Okay, so can we get the same?" Um, so yeah, and then we had to start, and I had heard some things about PWAs on conferences, and I knew just a little bit to be dangerous, but not enough to fix it. Um, and so I hope that after this session, you will all be at a point that when a client comes to you with the same question, you at least think, well, okay, we can work this out. Um, you're not going to know everything because there's a lot to know, and there are several subsections that could be a whole talk in and of itself. But that's okay. Um, I'll just start with the easy parts. The first part of the talk is even like comprehensible for salespeople and marketing people, and then we'll end up with some more developery stuff. So yeah, what's a PWA anyway? I'm gonna look at building blocks of PWAs, service workers, see how PWAs and Drupal combine, and then we finish with some development tips. Wait, what happens? Resume presentation. I think I. Oh, cool. Just found a new feature. So what's a PWA? If you ask many people, you get many different answers. A website that looks and behave as if it's a mobile app. For me, that's one of the more valuable descriptions. Um, Someone else called it a design pattern to develop app experiences using web technologies with different APIs. Well, it's all true, but it doesn't tell me anything, does it? Um, Jeremy Keith called it a man in the middle attack on your own website, which I really like because it is a really good description of what's actually happening underwater. Um, Google calls it websites that took all the right vitamins. Okay, well, that will probably appeal to the sales director at your company, but not to the developers, maybe. And yeah, those clueless salespeople, they will maybe call it the next big thing. And so I prepared this session 2.5 years ago, and I've been waiting 2 years to present here to you. And it still is the next big thing. So that makes you think about, okay, so are PWAs really the next big thing, or is it the promise that still hasn't been fulfilled? We'll look into that. Um, but yeah, if you ask me, PWAs can be the best of both worlds. Trying to provide the user experience that native apps have, but then served over the open web. That is basically the two worlds that PWAs try to combine. And how do they achieve that? Well, PWAs are or can be installable, which means that you have like a small icon on your app, on your mobile phone or on your laptop, um, as it's discoverable as if you have actually installed an app on your phone or on your device, whatever it is. It's network independent, meaning that it can react to offline state, anticipate the offline state, be available offline. It can be engaging, meaning that it can provide updates and notifications to trigger the user to come back to whatever it is you built. And still, it can be discoverable. Well, the content, after all, it's still a website, so you can find it in a search engine in Google. It can be automatically updating, unlike native apps. It can be platform independent, meaning that, well, if you just program a website once, it works on all devices. Same goes for progressive web apps. And the entry barrier to making something like this is a bit lower than building your first native app for either Android or iOS, because, well, this is already what we do, building websites, and we're just adding a bit of technology to that. But it also all depends on your service worker. It can be all these things, but it doesn't necessarily have to be all those things. There are some drawbacks as well. Platform support, both dependent on the operating system and the browser, is still a bit variable, especially on Apple and Safari. Sometimes it's better on mobile devices than on desktops. It's something you really get the feeling that it was conceived with mobile devices in mind. There is a bit of difficulty. There have been some initiatives, let's say it like that, to make PWAs available through app stores, but it's not ideal yet. And even though this talk has been in the works for more than 2 years, it's still kind of newish technology. Things are being added. Some APIs are still considered experimental. And, well, obviously, if you add code, it will increase the complexity for development and testing. So let's look at the building blocks of PWAs, because a PWA is not just a single thing. It's a combination of a couple of things you add to your website, and when you have those in place, you can actually call your website a PWA, or say you have added a PWA to your website. It's a matter of definition, I guess. And then also Lighthouse, Google Lighthouse, the performance analysis will actually tell you, right, your website is an actual PWA, but I'm not sure if it actually influences the SEO rating of your website. So if anyone knows, you can tell me later when it's time for questions. It's a combination of web APIs, service worker API, the web app manifest, push API, and notifications API are the most important ones. So a couple of requirements. To serve a PWA, it must be served over SSL with the HTTPS protocol. Well, it makes sense if you call this like this man-in-the-middle attack on your own website. We must be sure that it's all safe and encrypted. So that's why this is a requirement. There's just one exception when you're serving things from localhost. So really the localhost URL, then this is not a requirement. You have to load a service worker JavaScript file. This is basically just a separate JavaScript file that will be running in its own thread, and that's the core of how these things work. So this service worker needs to be loaded. And you have to provide a web app manifest. So that's a file telling visiting browsers that, hey, this is a web app. So looking at how it combines, so there are a couple of things that happen in the browser. So we have the application tab where your normal code is running, and over there you got your window object, and you got the DOM, you know, everything that we know of when we look in the inspector in Chrome or Firefox. And then there's the service worker. I just mentioned, it's just a JavaScript file that is being registered from the application app, and the application app will tell the browser, okay, so here's my service worker script, run it, fire it up in its own thread. And then the service worker can use other APIs like the cache API to cache information, or the service worker can make calls to the outside world. So the left part, that's all happening in the browser, and the server is accessed by the service worker. So this is important. Like, have to realize that the service worker is living between your application and the server now. So that's why it's called a man-in-the-middle attack on your own website. So this service worker, as said, it's a virtual proxy between your site and the server. It's event-driven, so it reacts to events. The most obvious thing is that when it's installed, you do something. When a request is made, you do something. As I said, it runs on a separate thread. Sorry. It also means that it does not have access to the window object and the DOM and everything that's happening in its application tab. It really is disconnected from it. The only thing it can do is like give back responses, just like a normal server would do, like it returns responses to your tab. This JavaScript is should be non-blocking code, so we use promises. Make a call to the server and specify, okay, when a response comes back, we do this or that. So this talk is not about JavaScript promises. That would also be a completely separate talk, but when you start developing stuff with this, you will run into promises a lot. So one of the most important things that your service worker does is control requests and caching. So the application asks for a certain URL, and then the service worker decides what to do with it. Am I going to fetch this data from cache? Do I have it in cache even? And I'm going to fetch it from the server, and well, those kind of decisions, the service worker is in control. It can also handle push messages and notifications, and maybe perform other tasks. In theory, you can make it do whatever you want, but if that's really something you need, you might actually need a web worker and not a service worker. But that, again, is another topic, another API. And one thing to really understand well is that you have only one service worker for all open tabs on the same website. If you open 3 tabs and those 3 tabs register the same service worker, then there's one service worker. And we'll get into that later, why this is important, but it's good to realize. And then even when you close all those tabs, the service worker is still there. It's been installed. It will still be running in the browser. Maybe if you're using a Mac, you've seen how even if you close all the browser tabs, the browser application is still running. It's the same idea. When you close all those tabs, the service worker is still running, and only when you really shut down the browser entirely, it stops running. You got a question? We'll come to that later. He was asking if I can give an example of service worker. I will give you one. Thing to note here is you have to be careful and use progressive enhancement. Not all browsers support this, so better build your website in a way that even if there's no service worker in between, it will still, the calls will end up at the server, and it will not work offline, and other things might not happen as well, but take care that your application still works if there is no service worker available. Okay, so one other building block is the web app manifest. Basically, this just tells your browser, I got a PWA here. It also helps making the PWA installable because it defines what it should look like, the display mode. So do I want a like a standalone browser with no Chrome and everything that makes it look most like an app? Icons, colors, stuff like that. So here's an example. At the top, that's how you would include it in your HTML. And then this is just like a bunch of JSON where you say, okay, so this is my icon and this is the theme color. So that will be used in by Android or Apple as the colored bar. Well, stuff like that. It's just all handled here. It's not really interesting, so I'm going to skip over it, but you will find the documentation when you need it. So then there's push notifications. Push notifications could be really cool, right? I mean, even when you're not on the site, you can send information to people who are interested in whatever it is you're offering. Like, hey, you got an email, there's a new message for you, or there's a new video, or there's a new podcast, or anything that you think that might engage the user with your application. To make this work, there are actually two APIs that work together. There's the push API. Push API is the protocol that is about communicating from a certain server to the service worker, pushing this information to the service worker that's running in the browser. And then there's the notifications API, and the notifications API is how the service worker can actually create a kind of pop-up in your browser saying, I've got a new message for you, or something like that. So there's two APIs, but because they are so closely connected, when you start using this, there's only one permission for this. So you will sometimes get this pop-up on a website. This website asks permission to send you notifications. So when you click yes, you give permission to use the push API and the notifications API. The big problem, this is not yet supported by Safari and Safari on iOS. So we would love to use this like native apps can already do, but this is a big drawback. It just doesn't work. A month ago, I read that there is now a hidden setting to enable an experimental feature in iOS Safari to enable the push notifications API. So some people said, yay, we can now, it's almost there, but it doesn't work. But I mean, it's kind of a hint that the developers are working on it, that it might happen eventually, but well, on the other hand, this site hasn't changed in 2 years. So let's hope that it gets there one day, because that will be a huge bonus for the adoption of PWAs. Cool. So now let's have an even closer look at service worker, how they're implemented, what a lifecycle means. Talk about a bit about caching strategies, pre-caching, and background fetch. So here we have a really simple service worker example. The top code, I hope it's readable even from the back. Otherwise, there are chairs. It just says, okay, so if our navigator, our browser, supports service workers, register this service worker. It just points at a file and says, okay, so there's my script. Treat it as if it were a service worker, meaning run it in its own thread, and it will respond to certain events. And then there's the service worker itself, which in this case has one event listener. It says, okay, when this service worker is installed, execute this function. Wait until the caches have been opened, and then when the caches have been opened, add to those caches index.html and CSS/style CSS. So this basically means service worker, go get index.html, go get my style CSS, and add it to a cache bin that I have called static v1. So this doesn't do anything else because, well, it's now in cache, but it's not yet served from cache. So that's what happens here. I'm adding another event listener and say, okay, when there is a fetch event happening, what do? I respond because, well, this application tab, it did a request, it expects a response. So what I'm going to respond with, well, I'm looking if there is a match in the caches between the event request, and if that's the case, I return it, and otherwise I just fetch whatever it is. So I take it either from cache, or I perform the fetch myself, meaning I'm getting it from the server. So this is a really basic example, but you're already seeing how it's treating its cache. If it is in the cache, I will serve it from cache. Otherwise, I'm going to fetch it from the server, meaning that is pretty fast because if it's already cached, well, bingo, we don't have to make the round trip to the server, and your client has the response earlier. On the other hand, it might be outdated, right? So that's where we're getting into cache strategies later. But first, let's look at the life cycle, because one of the things that I found hardest when I was starting to work with PWAs is like understanding, okay, so when does this all happen, and how does this all happen, because it's on a separate thread, and okay. A service worker has a life cycle, as it's called. First is registered. Well, we saw this call in the browser. We register a certain file and tell the browser, so this is considered a service worker. Then the browser will install this file, start up the thread, and then it's installed. And then it has to be connected to the application tab, meaning that the request that the tab is sending is now routed through the service worker instead of going directly to the internet, to the server itself. And then finally, it might get redundant when there's a new service worker, for instance, or also if errors happen during install or activation, then it will be redundant. And this period between activated and eventually becoming redundant, then it's just there listening for events to happen, waiting to respond to events. Once you know this, you will find that when you're starting working with PWAs and service workers, that sometimes you have to influence this life cycle, and that's why it's important to understand the life cycle. For instance, when you're activated, it doesn't automatically mean that you're going to intercept all requests from your associated application tabs. Usually it only happens if you don't do anything else. It only happens once you refresh the page. So at the first page request, the service worker is installed, but it's just waiting there. And then when you refresh the tab, it starts working. But except if you don't want that, you can use an event listener and say client's claim, meaning, okay, I'm now actively inserting myself in between the tab and the internet. Oh wait, no, sorry. That's the second example, actually, what I just told, and the claim is just a bit before that. Is about telling the browser, like, all tabs that might be open that work on the same website, the same domain. They're also like mine, speaking from the service worker point of view. These things can really nip you in the butt if you are working and testing your service worker and you think, why isn't it working? Shouldn't it be working right now? I don't see the caches being primed. Well, maybe it's just still waiting. It hasn't claimed this tab, things like that. If you're developing in Chrome, in the Chrome inspector, there's an application tab, and there there's an update on reload option and a skip waiting button, which also help you influence this life cycle during development. Okay, so then caching strategies. This is an important one to understand and to think about when you're starting working with this. Basically, there are two choices. You can either prioritize up-to-dateness, so to speak, or prioritize performance. If being up-to-date is really important from you, well, you can just say, okay, I'm going to fetch from the network only, period. Or you can say, I'm going to fetch from the network first and fall back on cache if there's no response or it takes too long. Okay, sure, can do that. You can also prioritize performance, like just, okay, I'm only going to serve things from cache. That's a bit weird because, well, how would it get into cache, right? I mean, also have an answer for that, but it's not a common strategy that's actually used. But you can take it from cache first and fall back on the network. That works. But then the third one is an option that's used a lot, and because it's a really great balance. It's take things from the cache first, so people have a really quick response, and then update the cache. It's called stale while revalidate. So you get stale cache, and in the meantime you're revalidating, and you could even, depending if this probably works better if you have like a decoupled situation going on than if you're like serving entire HTML pages. But you could, once the cache is updated, push the updated content to the application also. So in this way, you can like be fast and still be up to date. Right, and so then there's also pre-caching. Pre-caching means we're not even going to wait until someone requests a certain URL or a certain asset. I'm just going to cache it right away. And that's cool. I mean, sometimes you have like an interface where people scroll through multiple articles. Well, if that's the case, you can pre-cache the next article in line, and they will have it immediately when they click next. That's cool. The specific application that we built a PWA for is for the Dutch organization of house doctors. They have got a huge library of guidelines for all kinds of common diseases and complaints, where they have like a list of things to check, to ask, typical types of medication, other things to consider. And those house doctors, sometimes they are in a situation where there's no internet. Literally, some of them work on submarines. So this means that they wanted to have this information available offline. So that's where pre-caching comes in. We allow them to just, at a click of a button, download all the content. So they have like these 140 guidelines all downloaded on their machine, and they can, well, safely go offline and still have it all available. Now this is 140 articles with a lot of content, like just references and scientific stuff attached to it. So it's a lot of data, and in those cases you must be careful with bandwidth and storage space. We don't want to force someone to just download 140 huge nodes with tables and images and assets and stuff. So yeah. Also, don't take it for granted. It's a great technique to do the best we can, but browsers can clean up cache data, or set a limit on the amount of storage that a certain app can use. Um, so yeah, that's a thing to take into consideration. And also, assets don't cache themselves. You can't just say, okay, here's my indexed HTML, cache it. I mean, yeah, you can say it, but it will only cache like the actual HTML response. And if there's CSS attached, if there are images attached, if there's anything else attached, you will have to go and cache it all by yourself. Right. And then background fetch. Background fetch is another really nice API which you can use, although it's still rather new. It's in the experimental phase. Only Chrome supports it and right now, so it's not yet in Explorer or Firefox or Safari. But the cool thing about it is kind of, how to say, offloads the act of downloading to the operating system. So our example of this application for house doctors, where they can click a button and download 140 nodes, they will have to keep the tab open until the download has completed. Because if they close it, it starts downloading because yeah, the operating system just like purchase unused apps. And when you come back, you say, okay, did the download finish? No, it did not, because you closed the browser. Um, Now, background fetch can like offload it to the operating system. So the operating system will take the downloading of this content, and then when you open the browser again, it will notice that the download is finished, and voila, there you go, Bob's your uncle. So this is really cool, but experimental. But yeah, it's yet another addition to make this all really work smoothly, and again, provide the user experience that native apps can also offer us. So we're getting closer to the Drupal ecosystem now. How many? Just gonna ask. Thanks. So there's a Drupal PWA module, which is, I mean, after all, why we'll started using Drupal, right? Because there's a module for that, and I don't have to invent it myself. And indeed, it is here. It's installable. I mean, it makes your website installable. The module itself is installable, obviously, but that's not really special. It makes your website installable as if it's a mobile app. It provides caching. It is somewhat configurable, but there are a couple of downsides too. So let's look at it. It has a stale while revalidate cache strategy for CSS and JavaScript. It has a cache first and network fallback strategy for content. So it's rather fast and well, will fetch from the server if it hasn't been cached previously. And there are some configurable pre-cache URLs. So if there's a couple of pages in your site that you think that might be really interesting for your users, for instance, the homepage or the news overview, something like that, you can just insert it, and then the module will make sure that it's added to the service worker config, and that those URLs are pre-cached. One other really cool thing is that it has automatic asset discovery for those pre-cached URLs. So meaning if you enter, okay, I want this news overview to be pre-cached, you only have to enter the URL and it will self-discover the CSS files and the JavaScript files and the image files that are needed to completely render this page. So how can it do that? Cacheability metadata. That's a really nice use case, I think, for the whole caching system that Drupal has. It wasn't like actually intended for this, but it works. I mean, when you load a page, you can see everything that's attached. So that's really cool. Um, Also, it will render or set up a web manifest. Um, well, as said, this makes sure that your app is installable. You can configure the icon. You can. It will take the name, the app name, from the settings of your website. So, yeah, pretty much automated and a good starting point. And then there's also a couple of ways to tweak things, like this hook. These pre-cache URLs can be altered. So maybe you don't want to enter direct URLs that should be pre-cached, but there's some logic. Maybe you want to pre-cache the most recent news article, for instance. Well, you can have this code and discover what is my most recent news article and then add that URL to the pre-cache URLs. And again, page assets are discovered automatically, so that's really nice. Right, so it does a couple of things pretty much out of the box or with a bit of configuration, but there's also a couple of things that the PWA module does not do. Push notifications are on the roadmap. A PWA library, such as Workbox, I'm going to talk about that more, is also on the roadmap, but not yet there. There's a couple of issues about easier debugging. More tests are being added. So yeah, things are improving, but at a certain point, you might find yourself thinking, "Yeah, it's not exactly what I needed." So really, the PWA module, if you're going to add a PWA to your site, if it suits you, if it does what you need, cool, do it. Install the module, it's okay, it's good. But if not, go to custom code as quickly as possible, I would almost say. So yeah, that's where Workbox comes in. Workbox is a library developed by Google that makes a lot of PWA code easier to write. So it got like these caching strategies built in. You can write it all from scratch, but it's just easier with the library. So a couple of notes about developing PWAs. Debugging can be hard, partially because of this life cycle thing. Because you're not always sure what's happening in the background, because you can't really like place an inspector in your service worker. So yeah, it takes a bit of getting used to. In a way, it's a different mindset of thinking about what's happening in this browser. Also, be patient because sometimes it takes just a bit of time for caches to prime, and if the caches don't prime and you hit refresh because you think something's wrong, it will start priming those caches again, and well, then you're getting nowhere. And especially if you're developing on your local system, you may have turned off all your Drupal cachings, so the priming of the pre-cache URLs is slower than you expected, and well, patience is a good thing, always a good thing, but especially developing PWAs. So yeah, and also hang in there. It will start making sense. As said, it's a bit of a different mindset, but you will get there. Yeah, so then there's the Chrome Inspector, as I said. I mentioned these before, but it's good to know where they are. These are screenshots taken from a Google tutorial about PWAs, but the thing is on the right. So there's this application tab, which if you have never built PWAs, you might have never even noticed, or never used because you didn't know what it was for. Well, when you start working with PWAs, you will need it. And then you got on the left, you got service workers, and then you will see that there is a update on reload checkbox. Um, so that's a handy way to immediately activate a new version of your service worker when you've changed your code. And as you can see, you can also switch it to offline over there, and that's a handy way to test if this offline caching strategy that you've implemented actually works. And then there's also the skip waiting button. What you see here is the situation where a previous version of your service worker was activated and you've changed your code and it's now waiting. And waiting, that means the other one is still running, but uh, um, we're not yet switching to the new one. So there's the skip waiting button. You can also like implement this from the event within your service worker, but that's not always what you want, because if your PWA is handling user input, it's not a good idea to just swap out new versions, because user input might get lost or might be treated differently because the versions have changed. So that's why new versions are not automatically applied. You explicitly have to say, okay, skip waiting, it's okay, I trust this, let's go on. And this is especially important when you got multiple tabs open on the same website, because they all have to be reloaded before your new version of the service worker is applied, because after all, there's only one service worker for all of them. Okay. Finally, some resources. Documentation, fortunately, is pretty good. I get the impression, well, they developed a huge library and they invested in documentation. I get the impression that Google really wants us to use this kind of stuff. It's up to you to decide if you really want to do what Google wants you to do, but that's a whole different story. No, but seriously, there's a lot of documentation and guides. It's pretty easy to find, but here's a couple of documentation and tutorial resources. So if I share this presentation in PDF form with you, you can actually click them, or you can just make pictures now. Cool. So before we get on to the questions, thanks to Calibrate and Dropsolid for sponsoring this event, and of course all the gold and silver sponsors as well, because I really appreciate that they make it possible for us to be here again together. Thanks. Questions over there?
Hi. Yeah, it's working. Hi, Mark. Thank you for this talk. Very interesting. You mentioned that iOS Safari support was limited.
Yeah.
Which is kind of disappointing for me to hear. I was hoping that you would say these sheets are 2 years old and now the support is great, but apparently it's not.
No, it's what I was hoping when I was updating the presentation to finally be presented here, but no.
It's kind of surprising to me because it seems like, especially in the last few months, I've been following Jen Simmons on Twitter, and she's part of the team for Safari, and they seem very ambitious to support like the latest cutting edge CSS standards.
Yeah.
So do you have any idea why this support is lagging? Do you see it as a question of time, or is it because it's a Google initiative, or why are they not supporting it?
No, it's not really a Google initiative, although Google is pressing for it. But officially, I don't think they have ever given an explanation. What I think is that it is a threat for their own app store.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, just about their way to make money.
So there goes all hope.
Well, well, yes and no. I mean, as said, there is some hints of experimental support in iOS right now. So, yeah, I still have hope.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, right behind you.
So just to follow up on what has just been said, if I remember correctly from what I've researched, PWA support is available on iOS, but it is only push notifications that is not.
Well, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
No,
and
that's completely true. Yeah.
And also, you didn't mention this, but from PWAs, because you can install them as apps on your mobile or on your desktops, you didn't talk about hosting them onto the different stores.
No, indeed. Yeah, it's partly because no, I don't have a personal experience with that. Um, it seems to be possible. When I was researching this 2 years ago, it was still flaky at best. But maybe your research is more recent and it's better possible now. But
Well, Google fully supports this, and iOS it is possible, but like I said, they will do background checks on your apps, and they don't really like PWAs that much,
yeah,
like you say. And then push notifications is also quite the hassle. So yeah,
yeah,
and also Microsoft is also really keen on doing PWAs. So they've started working on an open source project called PWA Builder, which you just type in the URL of your website, and it takes you through all the steps to create a base PWA service worker, manifest file, etc. So there's really a plethora of tools that's available, and Google is really the one that's most advanced right now with Workbox.
yeah.
But yeah, there's, I think, a lot of movement going forwards for PWA.
Yeah. Thanks for the additions. Thank you. Yeah, come on behind you.
Hello, Mark. Thank you very much for the clear presentation,
Welcome.
Seljuk here. Quick question. Are the service workers always active in the background, and when are they deactivated?
Oh, good question. In theory, they should always be active, at least once they have been installed, and so there's like this short startup phase. But then I've also read about different browsers on different platforms that may decide to eventually kill the process after all, because they think it hasn't been used for long enough, or the other way around, because it's making too many requests and downloading too much data, because, well, there's also like the responsibility of an operating system to make sure that resources are shared in a fair way.
Okay.
So yeah, in theory, yes, they will be running, but it's difficult to be completely sure.
Because also from our security perspective, can everyone just inject any service worker they want? And isn't this a security issue or a vulnerability?
Can well, well, no, I mean, anyone who builds a website can insert a service worker into their own website, and then, but really, what it can do is limited to like intercepting the requests and still pushing it to some server. So I don't think there's really a security issue going on, because after all, it just like rerouting things that would already happen when the application just makes its server calls directly.
Thank you.
Welcome. More questions in the back.
Can we pivot? And then without...
Yeah, hit the monitor. Yeah. Brilliant.
So, so it's not actually the question for your presentation, because it started from the title, what if the client wants PWA? And why should the client want PWA? So what are the kind of alternatives? What are the reasons to choose it? like examples where it works, where it doesn't work, like
Mhm.
for this general, how much does it cost to develop like PWA? So how it is like the
Yeah.
reasons for doing it.
Yeah, great question. Really broad. I think, um, well, it really depends on the client. I mean, the client that asked us for this specific project in the House Doctors organization, the offline availability was the most important reason for them. Um, for others, it could be speed, cacheability, or this is desire to be installable as an app. Um, so it's really hard to say exactly which one is most convincing for people. Um, so yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Well, just maybe you show like except your application some examples in the wild. So here here's really makes sense to like
Yeah. Okay. So
because like download you say like it's I have very stupid idea what what you're doing. So this is an application website which gives access to some library. Uh, okay, go like make an archive of this library, download zip, and you get this whole.
yeah,
I know this stupid. There's
yeah.
much more in the inside, but
Yeah, there's much more. Well, one great example I think I found when I was preparing this talk was the application of a podcast app. So people might want to select a podcast they want to listen and download them in advance and then listen to them maybe when they're on the plane or something like that. So that's the offline part. And then also, obviously, when there's a new podcast being published, having a push notification because you might be interested, that's a great reason to build a PWA. And obviously, people coming from a platform like iOS or Android, which is really based around installed apps, being in that list can also make you more visible as a publisher. So I think those three are the most important reasons to choose for a PWA. And then why not do it as a native app? Well, I think that's really a matter of like doing it once and having both a website and an app on both iOS and Android platforms. Yeah, if you can build it as a PWA, I think it's a more cost-effective way to do it.
thank you.
Welcome. Cool. I think we have to finish. Um, if your question has not been answered, just find me somewhere in the sprint room or elsewhere. And thanks again, and see you later.